So this morning, Mr. Richards, we have the presentation in respect of Manchester.
That's right, sir.
Yes. Let me just say a word or two to those who may be watching online. I was right to put the figures in the above 100 yesterday, and I imagine it may be something very similar today. There is, of course, no live witness today. There is the remote presentation. Ms. Richards.
So yes, so today's presentation focuses on the Manchester Royal Infirmary's Haemophilia Centre. It was a reference centre and one of the largest reference centres in the United Kingdom in the 70s and 80s. We've obviously heard from Professor Hay about Manchester from 1994 onwards, so the documents we're going to look at focus on periods prior to that. We have prepared a written note which core participants have had access to, which sets out what we've gleaned from documents that have been supplied to the inquiry. Inevitably, what the documents I'm going to refer to today are a selection from a much larger number of documents. Inevitably also, the picture is an incomplete one. We do not have a statement from anyone who was in a position of responsibility at Manchester in the 70s and 80s in terms of being a consultant or director. The earliest we have is a statement from Dr. Guy Lucas, who arrived in 1989 and became a Haemophilia Centre Director for a short period of time prior to Professor Hay's appointment. And so it's an incomplete picture from which you, sir, will have to in due course draw inferences, and you will no doubt be assisted in filling in the gaps from consideration of the fairly substantial number of witness statements from patients or patient relatives that the inquiry has received. Manchester Royal Infirmary was part of a bigger regional haemophilia service in the northwest of England, which included, in terms of the regional centres, Manchester Children's Hospital, the Lancaster Haemophilia Centre, and also Blackburn Royal Infirmary. Lancaster is sometimes described in the documents as a sub-centre, Blackburn Royal Infirmary as an associate centre of the Manchester Centre. We will be looking further at the Children's Hospital, the Lancaster Centre and the Blackburn Centre in March, when we try and address all of the haemophilia centres whose policies and practices haven't otherwise been explored through either oral evidence or an earlier presentation. In terms of directors, we know that Dr. Israels was the director during the 60s, and then Dr. Delamore took over. We don't know very much about Dr. Irvin Delamore's early career. Documents suggest that he worked in Edinburgh, then he went to Blackburn Royal Infirmary. By 1971, he'd moved to Manchester Royal Infirmary, and he took over from Dr. Israels and remained director until 1989. His co-director for a significant period of time was Dr. Richard Wensley. We see Dr. Wensley attending a UKHCDO meeting in 1971, at that stage on behalf of Bristol. He joined Manchester in 1974, and we can see a somewhat unusual arrangement in that he worked both as a consultant haematologist as part of the Haemophilia Centre and as part of the Northwest Blood Transfusion Service. And he had a particular interest in and expertise in the production of cryoprecipitate, which we'll come back to at a later stage. We can look at one document which casts a little further light on the position in relation to Manchester. Shomik, it's NHBT 00965549, please. And if we go to the second page, first of all, we can see there's a letter from Dr. Gunson, who was the director, the regional transfusion director in Manchester for the Blood Transfusion Service, February 86, and he refers in that letter to providing a short statement about the regional haemophilia service and to comment on Dr. Wensley's role. And if we go to the next document, please, we can see, if we look at the first half of the page, some background information about the arrangements in Manchester. It says the Regional Haemophilia Service is responsible for the treatment of adults suffering from haemophilia and is based at the Manchester Royal Infirmary with a sub-centre at Lancaster. There are co-directors of the service, Dr Delamore, consultant haematologist with Central Manchester District, and Dr Wensley, consultant haematologist, Central Manchester District, 5 sessions, and Regional Transfusion Centre, 6 sessions. Dr D. Lee, who is, so not Dr Richard Lee, who we heard about yesterday, who was based in the West Country by this time, but Dr D. Lee is the consultant in charge of the Lancaster Transfusion Centre, manages the sub-centre in Lancaster. Children suffering from haemophilia are treated by Drs D. Evans and R. Stevens at the Manchester Children's Hospital, though this also forms part of the regional service. The Haemophilia Centre at Manchester Royal Infirmary is also designated as one of the 6 national reference centres. And then there's a description of, prior to 75, the principal method of treatment for haemophilia being the use of cryoprecipitate, which was prepared from human plasma at the Regional Transfusion Centre. And then a reference to factor VIII concentrate now being used in increasing quantities. There's then a discussion about self-sufficiency and shortages, which we'll come back to. But if we go a little further down the page, just below the paragraphs numbered 1 and 2, we can see the arrangements in Manchester, a little different from elsewhere. It says this, in the middle 1970s, when factor VIII concentrate was first purchased in this region, my predecessor arranged with Dr Lane that these purchases should be undertaken through the BTS, so Blood Transfusion Service, budget. Whilst the quantities used were small and finance was more readily available than it is now, there were a few problems with this arrangement. And then he talks about there now being significant different problems and asks for a change in the arrangement. So as we will see, purchases of commercial concentrates, as well as the procurement of Elstree BPL concentrate in Manchester, were all done through the Blood Transfusion Service. If we go to the next page, we can see a little more information about Dr Wensley's dual role, which again is a somewhat unusual feature. Dr Wensley was appointed as a consultant haematologist to the Regional Transfusion Centre, 7 sessions, and the Manchester Area Health Authority teaching 4 sessions in March 1974. His job was to treat patients with haemophilia at the Manchester Royal Infirmary and to be responsible for the production of cryoprecipitate, which was at that time the product of choice for the treatment of these patients. He worked very hard and devised a semi-automated method for producing high-quality cryoprecipitate, again, we'll come on to that later, from which the patients in the region derived considerable benefit. However, since 1980, there's been a decline in the use of cryoprecipitate in favour of the factor VIII concentrate, and consequently the need in the Regional Transfusion Centre for someone with this specialised knowledge has also decreased. And then it goes on to explain how his sessions have been adjusted because of an increase in clinical commitment, so with more sessions being devoted to the Haemophilia Centre work than the Regional Transfusion Centre work. It's not entirely clear the precise date on which Dr Wensley became the co-director of the Haemophilia Centre with Dr Delamore, but we know that he did. Upon Dr Delamore's retirement in March 1989, Dr Wensley became the sole director. Dr Lucas then took over from Dr Wensley as acting director in 1992 until September 1994 with the arrival of Professor Hay. Now, excuse me, sir. In terms of physical facilities and staffing at the Manchester Royal Infirmary's Haemophilia Centre, those appear to have been pretty limited in the 1970s. And there are various references in documentation to Dr Delamore seeking financial assistance and grants from the Haemophilia Society to assist with things such as the purchase of a deep freeze. If we look at one document by way of example, it's HSOC 0016116_029. We can see this is a record of a meeting of the Council of the Haemophilia Society the 17th of March 1973, and Dr Delamore is recorded as being one of those present. If we go on, please, to page 4, Shomik, bottom half of the page. We can see under the heading Application for Grants from Research Fund, Dr. Delamore spoke about his application outlined in the memorandum to council members. He said that no major developments had taken place in Manchester for about 20 years. In order to improve facilities and expand the work of the centre, including a possible clinic for home treatment, a new system of records was required and the present staff could not cope with all this extra work. A request has been made to the Hospital Management Committee, but this is slowly passing through the various committees and will take a long time. Mr. Tanner said he thought the Society should help now to prevent delay in Dr. Delamore's plans, and that the grant could be considered as a bridging operation would help make the case for the health service to take over, and a grant for 1 year to cover the cost of secretarial assistance to allow the record keeping and the possible clinic for home treatment was agreed by the Haemophilia Society, extended for another year, and then in 1975 we know from other materials that the Regional Health Authority took over funding. If we look next, please, at PRSC 40421, we can get further insight into the staffing and facilities at Manchester in 1978. So this is documentation relating to a seminar organised, it would appear, by the Haemophilia Society in Manchester in 1978. If we go, please, Shomik, to the 3rd page, we can see on the right-hand side, second paragraph, the speakers being introduced. Dr. Delamore is the director of the Haemophilia Centre at the Manchester Royal Infirmary. The centre is a main reference centre and therefore acts in a supervisory and advisory capacity and has links with centres in the surrounding area. And then there's reference to other speakers. We're told also that Dr. Delamore's department deals with the whole field of haematology and its many specialisms. And then if we look on the right-hand side, we can see the text of what was being said by Dr. Delamore. You may be interested to note, sir, in the 2nd paragraph, reference there to cerebral head bleeds, which is something that's been picked up by other witnesses. And he says there, fortunately, they are rare, although it is one of the major causes of death. And then if we could have the bottom half of the page, please, Shomik. We have an explanation here from Dr. Delamore about the organisation of haemophilia centres, which may be of assistance more widely, as well as in understanding the position in Manchester. Dr. Delamore described how in 1968 haemophilia centres were reorganised into associate diagnostic and reference centres. Before this, Oxford, Sheffield and Manchester were 3 special treatment centres. In 1974, it was decided to make changes in the arrangements of centres. Centres should exist, first of all, to provide a service to carry out all the necessary investigations, including the identification of the special coagulation factors concerned, monitor coagulation factors and the effect of treatment, and investigate the relatives of patients with haemophilia and relative diseases. The second function is to provide a clinical service, which includes provision of medical treatment at any time of the day or night and at short notice for patients with haemophilia. Thirdly, provision of an advisory service for patients and their parents who might be concerned about dentistry, education and employment and so on, and provide a counselling service through the Social Services Department. Advice is offered also to GPs or anybody else who might be concerned with the management of haemophilia. Records of medical patients to whom haemophilia cards have been issued are made at the Haemophilia Centre and include all the necessary personal details of patients. And then there's reference here to the associate centres. The new category allows for associate centres who've been designated as suitable haemophilia centres for the provision of an emergency service for patients, but are linked to diagnostic centres so that together all the necessary facilities are provided. And we're hearing tomorrow, sir, from a witness who was at an associate centre. So this may be some useful background. The special treatment centres were changed to reference centres and were expanded to 7 in number. These are, if we go over the page, St Thomas's and the Royal Free in London, Churchill Hospital, Oxford, the Royal Infirmaries of Sheffield and Manchester, the Royal Victoria Infirmary in Newcastle, and the University Hospital of Wales at Cardiff. 2 main centres in Scotland, 1 in Edinburgh, 1 in Glasgow. The advantage of the more numerous associate centres is that patients do not have to travel so far to get treatment. And then you'll see there a diagram seeking to explain the relationships. There are 44 haemophilia centres in England, 58 associate centres. Associate centres in particular are growing all the time. The reference centres are expected to have special skills and to provide every facility that the patient with haemophilia might need. For example, a 24-hour telephone advisory service for both the patient and haemophilia centre or associate centres in the region, a special consultancy service for surgery, orthopaedic surgery, dental care, paediatric and social care, and to keep medical records and statistics. Together with a wide range of ancillary services, they must advise and organise such things as home therapy, prophylactic therapy where necessary, and to provide a reference laboratory service. Dr. Delamore outlined how they're expected to ensure close cooperation between all working sectors in their particular region and coordinate the availability of the necessary outpatient therapy material. One great problem is the shortage of factor VIII replacement therapy with which to treat patients. Dr. Delamore stressed how very important the link must be with the blood transfusion service. In Manchester, there is in fact a joint consultant between blood transfusion and haematology, that's Dr. Wensley. Although he spends nearly all his time in the haematology department on haemophilia, he has a special responsibility to see that replacement materials are present and supplied in regular quantities, and takes a special interest in the blood transfusion service. Dr. Delamore suggested that the key organisation in solving the shortage of treatment products must be the blood transfusion service. And then he goes on to talk about genetic counselling and other matters.
That description of the way in which Dr. Wensley spends his time doesn't fit.
It doesn't.
Because he was doing, at this stage, he was doing 7 sessions on blood transfusion and 4 on his clinical commitments.
Yes, you're right, absolutely right, sir. It doesn't quite fit. We can't, I think, shed any more precise light on that, other than we do see from other documents that he certainly maintained that dual responsibility for a number of years.
Well, the whole rationale for him asking to have 5 instead of 4 sessions for his clinical commitments was that he felt that he could not otherwise spend the 5.
Yes.
Which again indicates that Dr. Delamore was saying rather more of Dr. Wensley's services than they deserved.
Possibly so, yes. In terms of the physical layout of the Manchester Royal Infirmary's facilities, there's little by way of description from the 70s and 80s, and again, it may be so that you'll derive greater assistance from the statements of patients who attended than from any of the documents. We do see, and I won't go to the document in relation to this, but we see in 1990 discussions about the upgrading of treatment facilities, with 6 rooms to be made available for a haemophilia dedicated treatment facility. And there's reference to works due to be completed in 1991. You'll recall Professor Hayes' oral evidence. He described the facilities when he arrived in 1994 as being a small haemophilia centre attached to laboratories, which included a storeroom, an office, 2 consulting rooms, and a waiting area. And there were, by the time Professor Hay arrived, a nurse counsellor, 2 other haemophilia nurse specialists, and a clinical assistant. So that's by way of introduction to the arrangements at Manchester. The next topic I propose to address deals with the arrangements for the supply and distribution of products and issues relating to shortages. So, unsurprisingly, given what we've seen in relation to other centres across the country, Manchester also records difficulties in obtaining adequate supplies of blood products, really from the late 60s through the 70s and well into the 1980s. There are a number of national meetings attended, for example, by Dr. Israels, that look at the national picture in relation to the need for self-sufficiency, insufficient supplies and so on, which we've looked at a number of those already. In terms of Manchester's particular position, we can pick up the picture by looking at a letter from March 1969 from Dr. Israels. That's DHSC 01 00025_092. And if we could just zoom in on that, it's not the best of copies. So it's dated 12th of March 1969. It's from Dr. Israels to Dr. Maycock at the Lister Institute, Elstree, what became BPL. And Dr. Israels is writing to Dr. Maycock in Maycock's capacity as advisor to the Department of Health and chairman of the Blood Transfusion Directors Group. He refers to their having had considerable trouble in getting sufficient anti-haemophilic material to deal with a difficult case, a surgical case. He refers to having received some material from the Lister Institute, but that giving out and having to get material from Edinburgh. And he says this of course was not sufficient. In the ordinary way, we would supplement this by cryoprecipitate obtained from the Blood Transfusion Service. But the Manchester Blood Transfusion Service is quite unique in being unable to supply cryoprecipitate on any scale. This is as at 1969, the position changes in later years, because the regional board have still not provided the facilities for regular preparation of this material. So we've had to prepare it ourselves in our own laboratory. So far we've prepared 108 packs, equivalent to about 200 millilitres of plasma each. Dr. Stratton, who was the then director of the Regional Transfusion Centre, has mobilised his resources to a certain extent. If we go on to the next page, we zoom in. He says, I'm writing to you now because it's clear that this sort of emergency arrangement must be replaced by more permanent arrangements. We are, after all, the second largest haemophilia centre in the country, and it is surely quite wrong that we should be served by a blood transfusion service which is not fully equipped. Of course, this situation has been appreciated for a long time. I drew Dr. Stratton's attention and the regional board's attention to this matter at the time when it was agreed to form major haemophilia centres. Originally, it was agreed that by September 68, the Manchester Regional Transfusion Service would be re-equipped and staffed so as to be able to provide us with a proper supply of cryoprecipitate. It's now March 1969, and as you will see from the arrangements we've had to make, they are still hardly in a position even to cope with emergency treatments. And then he goes on to say in the next paragraph, I'm writing to ask you if in the interim, while the Manchester Regional Blood Transfusion Service gets properly organised, it would be possible for you to arrange for the Manchester service to draw on other services for a supply of cryoprecipitate. The response to that is at DHSC 013025_101. And we can see Dr. Maycock's response, 16th of April 1969, says, I've now had an opportunity to discuss in the department the proposal in your letter that the major haemophilia centre at Manchester should be able to obtain the necessary supplies of cryoprecipitate from other regions until such time as RTC Manchester can undertake this task. And then in the next paragraph, the development of facilities for preparing cryoprecipitate in RTCs has been uneven, and some centres are no more advanced than RTC Manchester. This arises mainly from two factors: the financial priority accorded by the regional health boards and the regional assessment of the urgency and magnitude of the haemophilia problem. It is true to say that no region is yet in a position to prepare as much cryoprecipitate as it needs. Under the circumstances, it's most unlikely that arrangements could be made for Manchester to be supplied from other regions in the way you suggest, although I'm sure other regions will, if they can, help in an emergency. That's the picture we get as at the end of the 1960s. It's clear from a range of materials that throughout the 1970s, obtaining sufficient supplies continued to be a problem. There's a general discussion of that in the Haemophilia Centre Directors, the UKHCDO meeting of 5th of April 1971, at which Dr. Delamore represented Dr. Israels. I don't propose to go to that. But then there is hope expressed in 1973 that with the appointment of Dr. Wensley, who had particular interest in and expertise, it was said, in producing cryoprecipitate, the position would improve. And there are Haemophilia Society records which suggest that, as at 1973, more cryoprecipitate was now being produced. However, we can see issues of supply continuing to dominate discussions, and if we go to CBLA 40454, we can see how, as at 1976, the arrangements were being made for the supply of Elstree concentrate. So this is a letter from Dr. Maycock to Dr. Delamore. And it says this: the ad hoc expert committee on the treatment of haemophilia and the regional transfusion directors meeting agreed earlier this year that concentrate prepared at BPL should be distributed in proportion to the number of haemophiliacs known to have been treated. The latest figures of patients treated are those for 1974, prepared by Dr. Biggs from information submitted by Haemophilia Centre directors. And then if we go to the next paragraph, the amount of concentrate being prepared at BPL is about 50% of the expected maximum production of 50,000 bottles, each containing about 250 in factor 8. It's expected that production should reach about 70 to 80% of target by the end of 76 and 100% by autumn 77, assuming the necessary plasma is received and that no unexpected difficulties occur. And then he sets out the quantities of concentrate to be allocated to Manchester and to Liverpool. And so it's what we can see here, it said that these are based upon the number of haemophiliacs undergoing treatment. Of course, we've seen elsewhere how this moved to the pro rata system, responding to the amount of plasma provided. But as at this date, the amount distributed will, to Manchester is going to be 240 bottles monthly, and to Liverpool 50 bottles. It's then said if there need to be any adjustments within the overall total available. We can see by correspondence in the following year, by the middle of 77.
Well, just pausing there. You may be coming to this, but one of the difficulties of a system like this might be said to be that it is calculating supply not on the basis of what is needed, but what on the basis of what was used in the previous year. And what we have seen repeatedly from other centres has been the effect of one or two individuals who suffered particular bleeds, whose demands meant that they used up a lot of whatever a concentrate or other replacement therapy they were using. So one would have expected that if the system was going to work properly, it would need some sort of reserve or flexible bank upon which to draw.
Yes, we can see there being particular problems in this regard in relation to Manchester from some of the later documents.
Was there any such, have we come across any evidence of any such flexibility in the system?
In terms of contemporaneous documentation, very little. I will show you Dr. Gunson's statement from prepared in the 1980s, but after the event, as it were, for the purposes of litigation, in which he addresses some of these matters. But there are various communications in which concern is expressed about available supplies being pegged to a particular year when the need was significantly in excess of that.
Yes.
So we do know that this initial figure of 240 was, the allocation was increased to 400 a month by June of 1977. Again, there are no single documents which really set out a whole picture. It's very much a question of looking at individual documents and trying to join the dots. Sticking with 1976, there was a meeting in October of 1976. It's CBLA 40473. We can see that this was a meeting that was intended to consider issues of supply and demand. Exploratory meeting of blood transfusion directors and haemophilia reference centre directors in Sheffield, 22nd of October 1976. We can see it's a meeting that had been called by Professor Blackburn. Well, possibly not, or he was going to address that. But the agenda sets out the need for at least 40 million units of freeze-dried factor VIII to treat the population? Is this estimate correct? Can the plasma needed to provide this amount of factor VIII be supplied by the transfusion service? If not, what steps should be taken to provide the plasma needed to supply factor VIII? Can a case be made to the regional health authorities to increase financial support to the regional transfusion centres to enable them to supply more plasma for fractionation? Should the regional health authorities be encouraged to increase the purchase of commercial factor VIII so that plasma now used to make cryoprecipitate could be sent for fractionation? If the plasma supply is increased, do we have the ability in terms of laboratory space, staff and equipment to prepare 40 million units of factor VIII and all of the other valuable plasma fractions in the UK? And then item 6 on the agenda, methods of distributing preparations containing factor VIII. The minutes then appear on the next page. They're not actually a very useful guide to understanding what, if any, decisions were made at the meeting, because they're actually a record of various contributions to the meeting rather than anything else. And so you may wish in due course, sir, to read the whole document. For present purposes, I'm just going to look at what's said about Manchester, which is comparatively little. If we go to the last page of this document, we can see Dr. Wensley saying, in Manchester, all factor VIII containing materials are distributed by the transfusion centre, including the commercial material. So that's a reference to the arrangement I referred to earlier, whereby the transfusion centre effectively supplied both NHS, cryoprecipitate, other materials and commercial. And then there's the somewhat curious intervention by Dr. Prentice, objection, Manchester money comes from the region and not from the district. Quite what that's a reference to is unclear. So it would appear that this meeting was a means for people to express concerns rather than solve problems. And at the end, we see the meeting closed at 1 p.m. No further meeting was arranged. There is then a local, as in to the Northern Region meeting from 1979 that we have a record of. That's at DHSC 0002195_037. So we can see this is described as meeting of the Northern Regional Group of Directors, 20th of September 1979. Representatives from Leeds, Sheffield, Manchester and Liverpool were present. It said it's not possible to arrive at a consensus agreement with respect to the recommendations on page 5 of this document. We don't have that, so we don't know what that refers to. But then this is a note which sets out various areas of discussion. And just, again, picking up matters of particular relevance to Manchester, paragraph 2, it said, with respect to pro rata supply, there was dissension by representatives from Manchester and Liverpool where the demand for cryoprecipitate was still great, and indeed, in the view of Dr. Wensley, was advantageous for the treatment of certain patients. Somewhat tantalisingly, we don't learn from this, or I'm afraid from anything else we've as yet unearthed, what particular categories of patients Dr. Wensley, who was clearly, from what we've seen, an enthusiast for cryoprecipitate, but what particular categories he thought it was advantageous for. But we can see at least that as at the autumn of 79 in Liverpool and Manchester, cryoprecipitate was still very much in use. And we see Dr. Wagstaff, so that's from the Regional Transfusion Service, confirmed that this was also a view being held by certain haematologists in the Sheffield region. There's then reference to a particular issue in relation to Manchester. It says this: a large number of single donations of fresh frozen plasma were used in the Manchester region for replacement therapy following intensive plasmapheresis. Also, because of acidification, the plasma following platelet separation was unsuitable for factor VIII production. Thus, although the Manchester region separate plasma from 40% of their intake within 18 hours, only a proportion of this was available for fractionation. and then there's a reference to the position in Leeds and Sheffield, and then a reference to anomalies with respect to regional practices. So it said it was felt that if certain anomalies with respect to regional practices could be resolved, pro rata supply was indeed a logical development, although it was conceded that if fresh plasma could be separated more economically in certain regions, it would be advantageous for this region to concentrate on that task. And then we see Manchester, in paragraph 3, Manchester and Liverpool considered that their demand and intended reduction of cryoprecipitate and other factors would not allow them to double the quantity of fresh plasma sent for fractionation. And if we go over the page, a hope is expressed that a dialogue could be set up with the super-regional haemophilia directors to determine realistic levels of factor VIII production. One region, Manchester, recommended central purchasing of factor VIII from commercial sources within each region. So we can see there the issue of pro rata supply being the basis for supply being discussed as at September 1979. But again, this records various views being expressed rather than giving a clear picture of what, if any, decisions were taken. It may be instructive, therefore, to look at Dr. Gunson's statement. That is at NHBT 0020196_001. Now, of course, this was a statement prepared retrospectively for the purposes of litigation, not a contemporaneous document. And so you will wish to record it such weight as you consider appropriate, sir. You'll see, insofar as Manchester is concerned, that Dr. Gunson sets out that from April 1980 to the 30th of September 1988, he was director of the North West Regional Blood Transfusion Service and based in Manchester. And he gives a little insight into the arrangements in Manchester. So he says this: as regional director, he'd previously been at Oxford for 5 years, I was responsible for the provision of the blood transfusion services to the district hospitals in the Oxford and North West regions. In both Oxford and in Manchester, there was a regional haemophilia service. While haemophiliacs are treated in hospitals, their management is under the auspices of the regional haemophilia services. Another function in Manchester, but not in Oxford, was the purchase of commercial materials within the RTC budget for the treatment of haemophilia patients. It was my responsibility, in conjunction with the directors of the haemophilia service, to negotiate the provision of the commercial factor VIII concentrates to supplement supplies from within the NHS. The regional team of officers who subsequently became the regional management team allocated a specific budget for this purpose to the blood transfusion service, which was finally approved by the RHA, it's the Regional Health Authority. From this, we purchased supplies to fulfil the diverging gap between NHS supplies and demand. He then makes the comment, in general, the Regional Health Authority allocated sufficient finance, and I'm not aware of undertreatment for the lack of factor VIII supplies, although some urgent surgical procedures were deferred. There are documents which suggest a different picture to that. Demand certainly increased over this period. However, the Northwest region in general used less factor VIII per patient per year than other regions. Again, there are some documents that suggest that's right. He then talks about the arrangements for negotiating with companies for contracts over, so from 1982 to 1983, for contracts over £100,000, tenders had to be sought. And he describes then the tendering process. And then at the bottom of the page, he says a meeting was held with Dr. Wensley and Dr. Lee, that's from Manchester and Lancaster respectively, after the tenders were in, before the final order was placed. The ordering process occurred approximately once a year, normally February, March. However, in the last 5 years, because of increased usage, it was necessary to supplement supplies of commercial factor VIII in December/January. So they were running out by the end of the calendar year and having to purchase more commercial product. Dr. Wensley was very much involved in the purchase of factor VIII and was the person responsible for the distribution of both commercial and NHS products from the RTC. Dr. Lee, then consultant in charge at the Lancaster Centre, managed the supplies of Factor 8 allocated to that centre, and Dr. Evans those supplied to the Manchester Children's Hospital. If we then go over to the next page, please, show me at the bottom of the next page. The references to paragraph numbers are references to paragraphs of the statement of claim in the HIV haemophiliac litigation. So what follows are Dr. Gunson's comments from his perspective. But if we pick it up at the very bottom of this page, I used to hold regular meetings with the physicians who treated the haemophilia patients concerning supplies, how much, preferred products, etc. These meetings were ad hoc about twice a year from 1980/81 onwards. They continued until I resigned as director of the North West Regional Transfusion Service in 1988. Some were attended by the officers of the RHA, the RMO and the AGM personnel. So we've not identified minutes or other records of those meetings, at least thus far. And then in relation to Manchester, if we go on, sorry, Shimik, let me just check which page it is. If you go on another 7 pages, please. No. Back 1 page, sorry. Yes, if we pick it up at the bottom of the page, he says, within the Northwest region, we worked on a year-to-year basis with the local knowledge of consultants in the regional haemophilia service. This was based on the number of corrective surgical operations needed in the following year, together with the numbers of patients able to pursue a home treatment regime with an added percentage added for emergencies. Home treatment involves extra supplies of Factor 8 in that a haemophiliac would inject Factor 8 at the commencement of a bleed without waiting to see if the bleed was serious enough for him to attend hospital for treatment. If we go on to the next page, please, Shomik, and we look at the last paragraph, Dr. Gunson says this: although the use of cryoprecipitate declined nationally between 1975 and 1985, the usage in the Northwest region remained high as a result of the policies adopted by the Regional Haemophilia Service. Cryoprecipitate competed with plasma sent for fractionation so that the latter targets were not achieved. However, Factor 8 from cryoprecipitates was used to treat haemophilia patients, and this supplemented the supplies of NHS and commercial Factor 8 concentrates. And then he says that details of the production of cryo and plasma are available at the RTC and at the Lancaster Centre. And then in the next paragraph, between 82 and 84, the Northwest Regional Health Authority financed the alterations to the former ICL computer factory to provide a new regional transfusion centre. Coincidentally, they responded to my arguments to increase the plasma supply with additional financial locations for this purpose. In 85-86, funding was provided for a plasmapheresis centre at Plymouth Grove, and somewhat earlier, a similar but smaller plasmapheresis centre was established in Lancaster. In general, the production of plasma was divided in proportions of 2/3 from Manchester and 1/3 from Lancaster. The majority of the rest of the document deals with more general matters and will obviously need to be read in full, but rather than matters specific to arrangements in the Northwest. The perhaps somewhat rosy picture presented by Dr. Gunson in that statement is not always borne out by contemporaneous documents. And so if we look at NHBT 0089585, we can see here a letter dated the 18th of August 1982. It's jointly from Dr. Gullimore and Dr. Gunson to Dr. Lane, Regional Medical Officer, Northwest Regional Health Authority. And we can see it's concerning Factor 8 supplies in the Northwest region. We're writing to request a supplementary grant of £38,500 to enable us to maintain our treatment for patients suffering from haemophilia in this region. A combination of factors has brought about a situation in which the money available in the current financial year for the purchase of Factor VIII concentrates is insufficient for us to maintain both an adequate level of therapy for those patients already on home treatment and to enable us to expand our home treatment programme, although we already lag behind other regions in this respect. As you will be aware, the Factor VIII concentrate supplies for the region come from two sources. The Blood Products Laboratory from plasma supplied by the North Western Region Blood Transfusion Service, and then B, purchase of commercial concentrates from an allocation within the Blood Transfusion Service budget. Based on the 80 to 81 statistics, the RHA increased the revenue of the BTS to provide more plasma for fractionation. With respect to Factor VIII concentrates, it was anticipated that within 2 years the supply from BPL would equate with the total quantity of Factor VIII obtained at the 1980-1981 level, and then further details are then given. I won't read them all out, but the figures stand for themselves. And then if we go over the page, it said this: until recently it was anticipated that this level would be maintained in 82-83, with 1.5 to 1.6 million units coming from the BTS plasma fractionated by the BPL, and an allowance of £100,000, a reduction of £60,000 from the previous year for the purchase of commercial Factor VIII. However, certain unavoidable factors have operated to our disadvantage, both with respect to the number of units of Factor VIII which will be received and the clinical problems encountered so far in the current year. And then they set out a number of problems. I won't read them all out, but I'll just refer to each of them in turn briefly. First was an industrial action, so loss of blood, which led to loss of blood collection sessions for a period of time. Two was significant increase in the use of other blood products in 1982 compared with 1981, which was said would make it more difficult to attain the plasma targets for fractionation at the BTS. And there was going to be a reduced amount available for Factor VIII. 3 refers to building works at BPL and an inability for BPL to fully process the plasma sent to them. 4, sharp increase in Factor VIII to cover emergency surgery, and details are there provided. And then over the page, 5 is about the use of Factor VIII therapy as maintenance therapy for patients with inhibitors, which was a treatment policy pursued by Dr. Wensley. And so the letter says it can be seen, therefore, it's been possible to identify an additional expenditure of £38,500 for Factor VIII during the current year, and this must be regarded as a minimum figure. It's only the serious nature of the situation which has led us to write requesting a further grant. We'd be grateful if you could give this matter your urgent and sympathetic attention. The response from Dr. Lane at the North West Regional Health Authority is at LHBT 0089586. It's dated the 1st of September 82, and it said in the second paragraph, the general answer to your question is that at this point in the year, and in this year in particular, it is quite impossible for the RHA to find additional money for any expansion or improvement of any service whatsoever. I know this will be disappointing, particularly as the answer might have been different had you been able to foresee the need for expansion at the beginning of the year when resource allocations for regional specialty developments were made. However, that time is now past. I think it would be very unwise to assume that in the next 2 years any improvement for regional specialties will be possible. And then he says, having said that, in general, the authorities' policy must be to maintain all services at their existing levels, since our resources are not being actually cut, but only failing to grow. And then the letter goes on to say it's quite wrong that the actions of clinicians to place you as a supplier in reducing a service for haemophilia in order to improve a service for meeting platelet deficiencies. We must ask you to maintain all blood supplies, not only overall, but detailed subdivision at the levels pertaining at the beginning of the year. This must be made clear to clinicians who use whole blood, those who use platelets, and those who are using the products for the treatment of haemophilia. The general rule must be supplies held at last year's levels, it being for clinicians to determine which cases should receive priority. In general, however, clinicians must not use up the whole ration for the year at an early stage so that nothing is left for really serious cases towards the end of the year. I should be glad if you could arrange for some kind of monthly rationing process allowing reasonable flexibility for the irregular presentation of difficult cases. And then he says, I don't believe it's right to expect you to be the arbiter of life and death in terms of blood supplies. Issues of supply and insufficiency of supply continue to be raised in the first half of the 1980s. And so if we look, for example, at NHBT 0089582, we can see, for example, there was a meeting on the 15th of February 1983 to consider factor 8 supplies in the North West region, identified by Dr. Delamore and attended by Dr. Delamore and Dr. Wensley from Manchester, Dr. Gunson, and then we have Dr. Lee from Lancaster, Dr. Stevens from the Children's Hospital. Reference is made in paragraph 1 to aspirations from the Plasmapheresis Centre in Lancaster, which was due to begin operations in 83-84. Paragraph 2, Dr. Delamore commented that the current levels of factor 8 concentrate and cryo being pegged at the 1980/81 level was insufficient to meet demand. But it was agreed no action should be taken until it was known whether the specialty bid was to be approved or not. That's presumably a bid for extra funding. And then there's an agreement in relation to cryoprecipitate supplies in paragraph 4, and an agreement to maintain the monthly production rate of cryoprecipitate at 1,500 per month. Manchester Royal Infirmary would endeavour to economise in its use so that as at the 1st of April they would have some stock in hand. And then we see the bottom of the page, from the 1st of April 83, cryoproduction would be at Roby Street, which was Manchester, would be at the rate of 16,000 per year or 1,330 per month, of which 1,000 would be allocated to the Manchester Royal Infirmary. B, if the specialty bid is approved and when additional material is available for expansion of home treatment, cryoproduction at Roby Street would be reduced to 10,000 units per year, of which 500 would be allocated to the 500 per month would be allocated to the Manchester Royal Infirmary. And then over the page, you'll see paragraph 5. The supply for 1984-85 was dependent on the Plasmapheresis Centre in Lancaster, as yet something of an unknown quantity. And then, this is February 1983, you'll see there the problem of AIDS was discussed. It was agreed that no specific action should be taken at present, but the situation should be carefully monitored and a reappraisal of policy may be necessary if changes in treatment regimes have to be made. I'll come back to that, but we've identified no documents that suggest that there were any changes in treatment policy in response to the risk of AIDS. There are various other references in the course of 1983 to problems with funding and shortages and shortfalls. We can see that perhaps if we look at a letter from Dr. Gunson, NHBT 0096599_015. So it's a letter dated the 26th of October 1983 to the Senior Assistant Treasurer at the North West Regional Health Authority. As I say, it's from Dr. Gunson. I won't read the letter in full, but it is a letter which merits reading in full. It's about factor 8 supplies, and you'll see in the first paragraph, Dr. Gunson says, I decided to review the situation with respect to factor 8 supplies from April 1980 in order that you might obtain a more complete picture of the problem. The year 1980 to 81 is significant because in March 81 I presented a paper to the RHA giving details of the scheme to increase supplies of factor 8 and albumin products and demonstrated how these could be self-financing by 83-84 from the savings made on purchase of commercial factor 8 concentrates. And then he refers to the figures actually of units actually received in 80 to 81. Our expansion plans didn't come to fruition until later in 81, 82. He refers that all of the increase in factor 8 was used at the Manchester Royal Infirmary. 1982-83 was a difficult year, as you will recall. I was allowed an additional £25,000 to purchase factor 8. This resulted in the total quantity received being comparable with 81-82, although there was increased usage, particularly at Pendlebury, that's the Children's Hospital. During 1983-84, there was a significant increase in the factor 8 supplies from BPL, as we have expected, and during the year we should receive 2 million units, and then there's a reference to a grant made to purchase factor 8, that's presumably commercial factor 8. Thus, the total expected for 83-84 will be 3.62 million units, which is approaching the quantity available for the previous 2 years. We go over the page. He then sets out how the units have been used at the Manchester Royal Infirmary since the 1st of April 83. And we can see there home therapy, outpatients, elective surgery and emergencies, and the figures there. The emergencies have been particularly heavy during this period. 4 patients have been admitted with intracranial hemorrhage and have taken up large quantities of factor 8. It will be seen also there's been an increased usage at Pendlebury, and at Lancaster the usage for 6 months almost equals the whole of that issued for 82-83. Most of this increase is accounted for by one patient who fractured his femur and has received over 100,000 units of factor 8. And then there is a calculation of expected usage for the balance of the year set out. If we go to the next page, Dr. Gunson says this: it will be seen that the 2 quantities almost balance, but no allowance has been made for 1 elective surgery at the Manchester Royal Infirmary, and he refers to the waiting list for corrective orthopaedic surgery building up, 2 emergencies, and he says it's to be expected that some emergencies will arise during the latter half of the year. There are 2 problems associated with the supply of factor 8, a shortfall of material for use in the current year and a long-term problem with respect to provision of factor 8 concentrate in 84, 85 and successive years. Both of these have a common factor, which is the failure to open the plasmapheresis centre in Lancaster. And you'll have seen from the earlier documents, expectations were pinned upon the opening of that it would improve the situation in terms of supply, but that didn't happen. He then sets out various options to correct matters. 1, reduce home therapy. This region has the lowest ratio for home therapy in the UK. At the Manchester Royal Infirmary, only 30% of patients are receiving home therapy. The national average is 50% and the target is 70%. 2, prepare increasing quantities of cryoprecipitate at the RTC. This is a frozen product which has a high yield of factor 8 and can be used to treat patients, but is difficult to use for home therapy. By preparing this product, we would reduce the amount of plasma sent to BPL and consequently the quantity of factor 8 concentrate received in return. Before turning to either of these options with their serious disadvantages, I will be grateful if you'll consider the following proposals. The first proposal is essentially to ask for more money to use to purchase commercial factor 8, using the allocation which the Health Authority would have expended on the unopened plasmapheresis centre in Lancaster. And he says this factor 8 will be retained at the RTC as an emergency reserve. I'll try and obtain the agreement of my clinical colleagues to use it only for emergency purposes and for those elective surgical procedures that can no longer be postponed. And then 2, hold early discussions with respect to the policy for factor 8 supplies for the future, since I can confidently predict that at current rates of usage, we will not be self-sufficient in factor 8 in 83-84. Also, there's good evidence that even with current usage, the patients in this region are not faring as well as those in some other regions. We'll look at such data as we have about usage, but what we see is essentially the now familiar pattern of commercial concentrates being purchased to make up shortfalls because of insufficient supplies of NHS factor in Manchester as in other parts of the country.
When he talks about self-sufficiency on that the page which is currently on screen, what constituency does he have in mind? The whole of the country? Well, he's not in that capacity, is he?
Not at that stage. Later, he might have been able to answer for the whole of the country.
The we will not be self-sufficient. It could be a comment on the national situation. It's more likely, perhaps, to be a comment on the regional situation, is it?
I think read in the context of the letter and the reference to current rates of usage, which he's there talking about the Northwest region, I think it reads more likely to be a reference to the region rather than the national picture.
So, again, at the risk of interpreting something to mean what it doesn't, it would look as if self-sufficiency being measured by the ability to, A, produce enough plasma to send off to BPL to get back NHS concentrate, plus using enough plasma at the local RTC to produce cryoprecipitate to be used locally.
Yes.
Is that a fair reading?
I think so, yes.
And probably the most likely.
Indeed. So we've set out in our written note, by reference to the second half of the 1980s, continuing difficulties in relation to supply and shortages and decision making. I will come on in due course to such arrangements as were made and when they were made in relation to the move to heat-treated products in the context of the response to the AIDS crisis. But I'm not proposing to take you, sir, at this stage, or indeed those listening, to the materials relating to the second half of the 80s. We've set them out in some detail in our note, but they are less critical for the issues which you have to consider, sir, than the position in the 70s and in the first half of the 1980s. But I invite you to note, and you'll see it set out, there were continuing difficulties. And those are recorded not just in minutes of meetings, but also they seem to be difficulties that are known to pharmaceutical companies. There are particular concerns expressed by the Haemophilia Society about supplies in the Northwest region and the like. You may want to note one reference, which is to a letter from Dr. Wensley in 1990. The reference is NHBT 0018289. I don't need to put it up on screen, Shomik. But he there essentially sets out a concern that the region had been underfunded for years. And that his patients were receiving less therapy than at other major UK haemophilia centres. But it's not clear from that letter whether he has in mind the years as in decades or years as in the years immediately preceding the writing of his letter in 1990. There are also documents that we've referred to in the written note which show that cryoprecipitate was still being used as a treatment fairly regularly, at least until 1990. And there's reference to, however, the use having plummeted to a low level by 1994. So I'm going to move from issues of supply and the arrangements for purchase to looking at what information we have about the products that were, as a matter of fact, used. Again, it's a very piecemeal picture that we have from the documents. We don't have, for example, the kind of document that we saw in relation to Cardiff, where there appears to have been a contemporaneous treatment policy, although, of course, it raised in turn the question of whether that treatment policy was actually being applied. But we don't have anything of that kind in relation to Manchester, and we don't, as I've said, have any statements or litigation reports authored by Dr. Delamore or Dr. Wensley that would help fill in the gaps. We have some returns to UK HCDO, but only for the period with which we're really concerned, for the years 1976 and 1983, and then also we have a return for 1986. So that provides us with some indication, but not, unfortunately, a complete picture of product usage. And in particular, it doesn't tell us what categories of patients particular products were used for, or what the reasons were for preferring particular treatments or particular products over others. I'll just pick up the picture with a reference to cryoprecipitate, however, as at 1970, which I'm going to take from an article in the Manchester Evening News. It's a somewhat bleak article in its tone and may reflect social policies of the time. HSOC 0006206. So if it's a January 1970 article from the Manchester Evening News. If we could just see the whole of the text on the bottom half of the page, please, Seamus. Thank you. So much of it is an article painting haemophilia in a very bleak way, but the purpose for referring to it is for what it said about cryoprecipitate. So if we look at the, first of all, at the bottom, we don't need to zoom in any further, Seamus. The bottom of the second column, talking about children born with haemophilia, in the past their future was bleak. Physical injuries led to serious internal bruising and building, and ultimately severe crippling of the joints developed. Surgical operations frequently had fatal results. But today, so this is as at 1970, with modern methods of treatment and patient assessment, much of which has been pioneered over the past 20 years at the Manchester Royal Infirmary, haemophiliacs are for the most part able to lead a near normal, albeit hazardous life. Their great salvation comes in small plastic bags containing what is known as cryoprecipitate, the anti-haemophilic serum, an extract from the fluid non-cellular part of the blood, which is given to them intravenously and which enables their blood to clot. And then the very bottom column on the right-hand side, sorry, the right-hand column, bottom of the column, says haemophilia can now be contained. People rarely die from the disease and are not often crippled by it. And nevertheless, it is seriously disabling. And then there's, again, reference to the context of termination of pregnancies. The reason for referring to this, sir, is in the context of Manchester, it is identifying cryoprecipitate, rather than, as we've later seen, concentrates, as being that which transforms the treatment of haemophilia. And as already indicated with Dr. Wensley's work, we see cryoprecipitate regarded as a significant part of the treatment of haemophilia, certainly throughout the 1970s. If we then...
Well, it would fit with the life expectancy documentation that we've seen earlier, which showed that the very substantial increase in the expectation of life for all haemophiliacs came after the development of cryoprecipitate.
Yes. Yes, and we've heard a lot of evidence, much of it no doubt understandable, about the advantages of concentrate. But perhaps important not to lose sight of the fact that cryoprecipitate was seen as a very major advance in treatment indeed, and carried with it, as we can see from this, many perceived advantages.
Yes.
And we can see Dr. Delamore's preference for treatments from a questionnaire he completed for Dr. Maycock in December of 1972. That's at CBLA 40121. The questionnaire is headed Factor VIII concentrate for the treatment of haemophilia. Factor VIII concentrate is supplied as a freeze-dry preparation in bottles containing from 400 to 600 units. At present, the supply is insufficient for all needs. And then various questions and answers. How many patients with haemophilia do you treat regularly? 200. We can see Manchester was a very large centre. Would you prefer to use for the treatment of your patients? And then you'll see the answer given by Dr. Delamore is some cryoprecipitate and some freeze-dried concentrate. So neither one nor the other to the exclusion of each other, but a combination of both. And then question 5 asks how many single donations of cryoprecipitant bottles of concentrate do you need annually for your present treatment policy, and 11,000 cryoprecipitate, 250 concentrate. And then there's a request for how much you estimate you would need annually, which is also filled in by Dr. Delamore. So that's his preference as at 1972. And there's an accompanying letter from him at CBLA 40104. From Dr. Delamore to Dr. Maycock, saying he's completed the enclosed questionnaire. We prefer in this department to administer cryoprecipitate since it makes up into a smaller volume. If, however, freeze-dried concentrate were in some way altered so it could be dissolved more easily and in a smaller volume, we would probably choose that preparation in preference to cryoprecipitate. The answer to question 6, where he'd given estimates of what was required, is based on our present usage of cryoprecipitate and freeze-dried concentrate. But if freeze-dried concentrate were to become more readily available, it may be that these figures would be reversed. I do, of course, appreciate that the freeze-dried preparations are much more suitable for home treatment, which we now hope to institute in selected cases. We can see, for example, from correspondence between Dr. Delamore and Dr. Arenstam at Trelaws, in which Dr. Delamore recorded treatment given to Trelaws students during the holidays when they were back in the Manchester region, regular treatment with cryoprecipitate, and we have correspondence in the years 1973 and 1974 to that effect. We see, again from the contemporaneous documents, reference to the Royal Infirmary using haemophil by 1975. But really the first, a bigger picture that we get about treatment and product usage is from the 1976 annual return. And so if we could go, please, Shomik, to HCDO 5080_003. We can see it's completed by A.M. Byrne, said to be chief technician, and sent off to Miss Spooner at Oxford. If we go to the next page, we've got there the figures for treatment of carriers of haemophilia 2 treated with the mixture of cryoprecipitate and factor 8 concentrate. The next page provides us with information about the treatment of patients with von Willebrand's disease in 1976. 8 patients treated exclusively there with cryoprecipitate. And then if we go to the next page, we see the bulk of the treatment. So total number of haemophilic patients treated during the year, 139. And then we have 3 with factor 8 antibodies, 14 haemophilia B patients treated during the year, and 1 with a factor 9 antibodies. And then we can see the figures used. So in terms of cryoprecipitate, and I'll take the figure from units of activity, 850,560, NHS factor 8 concentrate 450,295. And then we can see commercial concentrates being used, a small amount in relative terms of Profilate, 1,520, a larger amount, although still small in relative terms, of Haemophil, 40,680, and then a more significant amount of Cryobulin, 325,087. We also see porcine factor 8 being used, and factor 9 concentrate being used, and then fibre, 564,420 units of activity.
In terms of factor 8, it looks then as though at this stage there was marginally more concentrate being used than cryoprecipitate.
Yes. We've put the figures in a table. and I think it gives us 36.8% cryoprecipitate, 35.4% factor 8. That's, and we then, to make up the 100%, we've got FIBA and porcine included. But yes, I think that's right.
That doesn't sound quite right, does it?
I'll check the figures later, sir.
Just
850,560 units of cryoprecipitate.
Then you add up the others.
Yeah, 817,582 units of factor 8 concentrate. So slightly more cryo than factor 8.
Yes. Yes. So this is probably about the point at which you might expect in the following years there'd be a bit more concentrate used than cryo.
Yes. Unfortunately, the next available return we have, which I'll come on to in a few minutes, is for 1983, and we certainly see a change. In terms of home treatment, you'll have seen some references to a desire to start a home treatment programme in the first half of the 1970s. The documentation in relation to the introduction of home treatment is pretty limited. We've got individual patient statements, which perhaps are going to be the best source in that regard. We've got a patient, for example, describing beginning home treatment in 1974. There is one meeting, which before we break, it might be worth looking at HCDO 40400, please, Shomik. So this is a reference centre directors meeting, the 27th of January 1978, and we can see that from Manchester, Dr. Delamore is there. If we go, please, Shomik, to page 8. There's a discussion on home treatment. So the heading for item 9 of the minutes is use of cryoprecipitate or commercial factor 8 for home treatment. Dr. Dormandy had several patients on home treatment with cryoprecipitate. She wished to know if the reference centre directors thought that such patients should now be treated with commercial freeze-dried concentrate. And then it says Dr. Delamore also had a similar problem and was seeking guidance. That would tend to suggest that home treatment with cryoprecipitate for some patients at least was a feature at Manchester in the 1970s. The recommendation of the meeting is, in fact, that all patients on home treatment should have freeze-dried concentrate. Again, we have various exchanges of correspondence in relation to individual patients between Manchester and Trelaws, which show that in the latter part of the 1970s, there's a mix of treatments being used, sometimes cryoprecipitate, sometimes cryobulin, sometimes other commercial concentrates, sometimes NHS concentrate. There's no particular pattern discernible in relation to individual patients that would suggest that at Manchester, a single concentrate policy or batch dedication policy was introduced. The available evidence from individual patients and their records at UK HCDO suggests to the contrary, that patients would often be treated with different products at different times over the years. So is that a convenient time to break? There's a little more to say
yes,
about this.
So 10 to 12.